What's the secret to crafting the perfect scene every single time? If you struggle with scenes that feel rushed, boring, or underdeveloped, this framework is going to forever change the way you write. I'm a book editor who's worked with best-selling authors at Penguin Random House, and this quality is what separates a powerful, captivating scene from one that I know we need to workshop further. Crafting strong scenes boils down to mastering the balance of action, dialogue, and narrative. Most writers have parts of their manuscripts that lean more heavily into one of these elements and neglect the others, which leads to scenes that lack depth, feel slow, and fail to keep the reader engaged. Masters of the craft know how and when to use each of these narrative modes to write scenes that are swift, engaging, and leave the reader wanting more. So let's break down exactly how to use action, dialogue, and narrative to craft the perfect scene. And we're going to workshop a sample passage together to do exactly that. The first pillar of every strong scene is the most obvious, but it's also frequently neglected, which leads to static, boring scenes. It's the physical action that occurs. Action is what keeps the story moving. It's what allows us to visualize what the characters are doing and understand how the plot is progressing. It ensures that the story is continually moving forward and propelling the characters along their journey. You might think you have enough action in your scene, but having your character stare out a car window and then reflect on a 10-page flashback isn't necessarily the most exciting way to deliver that information and keep your reader interested. By the end of a scene like that, we're going to be left wondering what actually happened. It's going to feel like we didn't make any meaningful plot progression. On the flip side, if your scene is too action-heavy at the expense of dialogue and narrative, then you're going to have an entirely different problem. Let's look at an example of this to see what I mean. I blow on the surface of my coffee and watch a woman clad in a hot pink snowsuit topple to the ground, skis akimbo. I tighten the plush robe around me and set my mug on the hotel room windowsill. Mason rolls over in bed with a groan and reaches for his phone. He grumbles about his employee Grant not making the edits to the pitch deck and picks up his phone to call him, even though it's 3 a.m. in New York right now. I take another sip of coffee. It's good that we can visualize what's happening in this scene and understand what the characters are doing in their physical space, but this scene ultimately lacks impact because it's all action and nothing else. There are no moments of narrative reflection to reveal the narrator's emotions. There's no exposition to tell us background on who these characters are or why they're here, and there's no dialogue to show these characters interacting in real time. As a result, it feels like we're being kept at arm's length from the narrator. We don't understand what's going through her head, and therefore we're not particularly emotionally invested in what we're seeing. This scene would definitely feel more balanced with additional moments of dialogue and narrative. So now let's explore what would happen if we put more dialogue in this scene. Dialogue is the second pillar of a strong scene because it allows us to understand how the characters interact and register the nuances of their dynamics. Done right, dialogue is an engaging way to deliver information to the reader and progress the plot forward while giving us a better sense of the characters' personalities. Well-crafted dialogue is what makes the characters come alive on the page and feel like real people. While every scene should have some kind of action holding it together, not every scene will necessarily have dialogue, though most novels have a substantial amount of it. But a common mistake I see when I'm editing novels is that authors rely too heavily on dialogue to carry a scene. This can quickly become tiresome to read, and the dialogue can start to feel disconnected from the rest of the story. Let's look at a revised example of this same scene that leans too heavily into dialogue. Wow, look over there, I say. That woman in the pink snowsuit just toppled over. Her skis are up in the air. I'm more concerned with that idiot Grant, Mason says. He didn't make the edits to the pitch deck I sent last night. I thought we muted our work emails. Also, isn't it 3 a.m. in New York right now? Yeah, but he got them at 7 p.m., so he had plenty of time to make the changes. Notice here that because there's no action at all in the scene, we have to rely on the dialogue to try to figure out who these characters are, where they are, and why. As a result, it's difficult to really make sense of what's going on. For example, the first line of dialogue has the narrator awkwardly describing what she's seeing, which feels forced and it would be much more effective to just show us what she sees via action. Additionally, because this scene lacks any type of narrative reflection from the narrator, it's difficult to latch on to what's significant about the dialogue. It feels like this conversation is a floating script that's happening in a vacuum. We're not seeing any of the responses or reactions to what's being said. This is an extreme example, but there may be places in your manuscript where you have a lengthy dialogue exchange that lacks any action or beats of narrative. This can create this placeless feeling and cause the reader to disengage in what the characters are saying. Remember, we need action and narrative to direct our attention to what really matters about what the characters are saying and make sense of what's significant about the conversation. So now we know that the perfect scene cannot be all action or all dialogue, but what would happen if it's all narrative? Let's explore that next. Narrative serves as the glue that holds your entire scene and really your entire story together. It's what fills in all the gaps and makes your story flow smoothly. Narrative includes your characters' internal reflections, emotional responses, and private reactions, all of which make up their interiority, which is a key element of fiction writing. Granting the reader access to what's going on in your characters' minds is what separates fiction from other storytelling modalities, where we're only seeing what's happening externally. Without understanding your character's interiority on some level, your reader likely isn't going to care about their journey or emotionally invest in the story, so it's critical to get it right. Narrative also includes any descriptions of the setting or of the immediate environment, all of which should be filtered through your point of view character's perception, whether you're writing in third person or first person. Another key element of narrative is exposition, which includes background details that provides context for what happened to your characters prior to the events of the story. It could include your character's past experiences, family history, or any context that helps us understand how they got to this place, mental and physical, where they are today. You'll see that there is so much important information you have to reveal to the reader via narrative, which is why nearly every scene should include some amount of it. But if you have too much narrative in a scene, you'll slow down the pace of the story. Let's look at this same scene again, revised to only include narrative. I'd much rather stay here in the hotel room than ski on the mountain today, but I'm not sure that I have a choice. Mason got us the most expensive suite at the resort, complete with a view of the main chairlift, a wood-burning fireplace, and a dedicated 24/7 concierge. I would have been fine with the standard guest room, but he insisted on doing our honeymoon right. To do things right with Mason typically meant spending more money. I think back to last night, when I questioned his late-night email to his employee, Grant. He'd sent Grant a laundry list of edits to make to their pitch deck, even though it was past 7 p.m. in New York. He told me I didn't understand the high standards he held for his team, that he pays them to be on 24/7. This scene is entirely dominated by internal reflection and flashback. We get the narrator's emotions and some backstory, but there is no action or dialogue to ground us in what's happening physically. As a result, it's difficult to know where the character is and what's going on around her. And if the narrative continues to go on like this, we'll eventually become disoriented and confused. So now that we know what not to do, let's look at an example passage that better balances the three narrative modes: action, dialogue, and narrative, to craft an effective scene. Full disclosure, I wrote this scene and all of these examples, so I'm not at all claiming it's perfect, but I hope it illustrates the point. I blow on the surface of my coffee and watch a woman clad in a hot pink snowsuit topple to the ground, skis akimbo. As I tighten the plush rope around me and set my mug on the windowsill, my stomach turns. I'd much rather stay up here, toasty and upright. Mason got us the most expensive suite at the resort, complete with a view of the main chairlift, a wood-burning fireplace, and a dedicated 24/7 concierge. I would have been fine with the standard guest room, but he insisted on doing our honeymoon right. To do things right with Mason typically meant spending more money. Nude save for his boxers, he rolls over in bed with a groan and reaches for his phone. "That idiot," he says. "Grant didn't make the edits to the pitch deck I sent last night." Grant, according to Mason, is never doing the work he was hired for. I thought we muted our work emails. Also, isn't it 3 a.m. in New York right now? I take a sip of coffee to quell my gurgling stomach. Yeah, but he got them at 7 p.m., so he had plenty of time to make the changes. I learned early on that to be in Mason's life meant accommodating his schedule. "You wouldn't understand," he'd said the first time I questioned his late-night work requests. "I pay them to be on 24/7. Like our concierge, I guess." Here's a color-coded version of the scene that shows which lines are action, dialogue, and narrative. The scene begins with action, which is generally a good tactic to use as it grounds the reader in the physical environment. We see the narrator sipping her coffee and tightening her robe. Then we get our first piece of narrative with the line, "I'd much rather stay up here toasty and upright," because this illuminates what's going on in her mind. Then the next paragraph is all narrative because it provides exposition on how the couple came to be at this hotel and reveals that they're on their honeymoon. After the passage of narrative, we see another beat of action where Mason rolls over and grabs his phone. Then we see the first dialogue. After Mason's lines, we get another moment of narrative where the narrator comments that Mason claims Grant is never doing his work. Then we see her dialogue in response and another action line of her sipping her coffee. We get another line of dialogue, and then the scene closes with a passage of narrative reflection, where the narrator reveals her feelings toward Mason's actions. This enriches the emotional landscape of the scene and complicates their dynamics. Do you see how all three narrative modes work together to craft a scene that is swift but balanced, action-driven but emotionally layered? That's what you should aim for in every one of your scenes. Some of your scenes might be more dialogue-driven, others more narrative-driven, and others more action-driven. But try to find that perfect Goldilocks balance where all three narrative modes work together to keep the reader engaged. If you're struggling to figure out what your scene needs more of, here's a quick cheat sheet. If your scene feels too slow, you probably need more action or dialogue to break up lengthy narrative passages. If your scene feels rushed or thin, add more narrative to give it more emotional depth. And if your scene feels placeless or like it's happening in a white room, add more action to ground the reader in what's physically happening. Now, there's another secret I didn't tell you at the start of this video. Even if you craft the perfect scenes, your story won't resonate with readers unless it has a captivating premise. But how do you know if you have a dud idea or the next bestseller on your hands? Watch this video where I reveal the proven formula that makes a story irresistible. Thanks so much for watching and happy writing.